Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's wonderful to have so many of you here today for today's lecture. I'm Emily Ziemba, Director of Curatorial Administration and Research Curator in the Department of Prints and Drawings. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the first program for the exhibition, Picasso Drawing from Life, which officially opens tomorrow. As we begin, a brief reminder to please silence your mobile devices. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker for this afternoon's program and the co-curator of the exhibition, Jay Clarke. Jay is the Rothman Family Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Art Institute of Chicago. Prior to rejoining the Art Institute in 2018, she was the Manton Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs at the Clarke Art Institute, no relation, and a lecturer in the graduate program in the history of art at Williams College. Her accomplishments are far too great to list, and I know you'd all rather hear from Jay. But most notably, she curated the 2009 exhibition here at the AIC, Becoming Edvard Munch, Influence, Anxiety, and Myth, an absolutely trailblazing re-examination of the artist. Just last year, she curated Edvard Munch, Trembling Earth at the Clarke Art Institute, and Bridget Riley Drawings from the Artist Studio in our own Prints and Drawings galleries. She has edited and contributed to numerous publications, including Innovation, Tradition, and Nostalgia, the Manton Collection of British Art in 2012, The Impressionist Line from Degas to Toulouse-Lautrec in 2013, and Picasso Encounters in 2017. Jay is a leading scholar on Käthe Kollwitz, Edvard Munch, German art at the turn of the century, and Paula Modersohn-Becker, her next project, so stay tuned. She received her master's and PhD from Brown University. Today, we're celebrating her most recent achievement as co-curator of the exhibition, Picasso Drawing from Life. Now, please, join me in welcoming my colleague and friend, Jay Clarke.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was a lovely introduction. Emily and I co-curated this exhibition. We worked on it together. We had a lot of wonderful, friendly disagreements, but the only problem is Emily was always right. And that's true. So again, thank you all for coming today. As you all know, or you will soon find out, Picasso lived a very long life. His career spanned 2 world wars, numerous artistic styles, and as we all probably know, many romantic relationships. So today we're going to look at Picasso's production, focusing more on his prints and drawings, and we're going to be talking about some of the printmaking processes that may be new to some of you. Also through the lens of his commercial printers, the art dealers who sold his work, some of the people with whom he collaborated, and the lovers and wives he had throughout his career. All these individuals shaped the artist and the phenomenon that we now know as Picasso. And although his name is world-renowned and the prices for his work go for staggering sums, he would not have achieved the level of success and fame in his career without all the people sort of behind the scenes. So we're going to be learning about some of these people today and how they intersected with his career. So just to let you know what is up here on the slide, that's Picasso on the left working with some of his printers. The man on the right with wearing a sort of an apron because printmaking is very dirty. His name was Jacques Freyot. That's Daniel Henry Kahnweiler in the middle, who was one of his art dealers. And then on the right, that's Picasso with Dora Maar, one of his partners, lovers at the time. And she was a fantastic surrealist photographer, and we're going to be seeing some of her work. So before we dive into the people and the art that they inspired, I wanted to give you a sense about how Emily and I conceived of this exhibition. Picasso's been in the news for, good reasons and uncomfortable reasons. And that's something that I think has very much come out in the last, I would say, 5 years. There was an exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum recently, which I had the pleasure to see, called Pablo-matic, which is basically an evisceration of Picasso by the comedian Hannah Gadsby. It was actually a very worthwhile, interesting exhibition. Then there's a question at the top. These are some articles online and in newspapers. The Me Too movement has finally come for Picasso. Notoriously cruel. Should we cancel Picasso? So, this issue of cancel culture and the question of Me Too around Picasso is something that a public institution we, of course, have to grapple with. And while we don't want to, tear him down and rip him to shreds, we also don't want to completely heroize him and, pretend he didn't do some of the things that he did. So we sort of tried to toe the line in this exhibition, as it were. So another way this exhibition, or the main reason this exhibition kicked off, is in the year 2020, we received a really outstandingly beautiful drawing from Picasso's Rose period, Head of a Woman with Chignon, which is a portrait of his then lover, Fernand. This was a partial and promised gift of Susan Manilow in memory of her husband, Lou. And if we can just give a quick round of applause, because Susan is in the audience. A really important gift. We don't have a major Rose period drawing in our collection, and we're absolutely delighted. But it got us thinking, all right, well, this is one of his models. What if we look at other models and other people in his lives? So that really sort of kicked off the idea. So rose means pink in French, so there's usually some sort of pink tonality. It's a time frame, but it's also a sort of coloristic, chromatic tonality. And then we see another portrait of her, Fernand, on the right. Fernand escaped a very dangerous and violent marriage, and she moved to Paris. And she became a model for artists in order to survive. Now, this was not considered an elevated profession whatsoever. It was sort of a step up from prostitution in the sort of, in the eyes of, a very different society. But once she started modeling for Picasso and their relationship began, he forbade her from modeling for anyone else, because when you model, you usually have to take your clothes off. So they moved in together, and they were together for many years. We see them here walking in the streets of Paris with two dogs, sitting in a cafe at the upper right. And then this is another artist who used Fernand Olivier as a model. And here we see her by the artist Kees van Dongen. So these three works, which we see on the slide, were created over a 4-year period, and they all depict Fernand Olivier. So the pair was together for 7 years, and it's interesting to see how his style and her face and the way he depicts her change. And these are all works in our collection, which is quite extraordinary. So in the summer of 2006, where the first two, the drawing on the left, the Manilow drawing, and the drawing at the center, were created, Picasso and Fernand spent some time in this small Pyrenees town of Gazole. And here we see her face and hair on the two on the left, rendered in very delicate passages. We can see her physiognomy, but there's something slightly abstract. He's not trying to be completely realistic. And then if we go to the right, another amazing work in our collection from 1909, which is also a portrait of Fernand, is when he's beginning Cubism. Now, Cubism is where the artist really facets the face. We can see that it's a face, but it's somewhat abstracted. He used sort of cool, natural colors, browns, beige, green, etc., but he very much disrupts the picture plane. This incredibly beautiful drawing, which is on the right, it's one of my favorites in the collection, which was also likely modeled on Fernand Olivier, we're not sure, but it shows, again, how Picasso approached the human head as a series of planes. And in some ways, I like to think of it as a two-dimensional sculpture, the drawing, and we're fortunate on the right to also have this in our exhibition, a bronze head of Fernand, where it's literally in 3 dimensions, broken into a series of planes. Between 1908 and 1914, Picasso and the artist Georges Braque, here we see on the left, they co-created the revolutionary style now known as Cubism. Again, this abstract style where the picture plane is faceted and everything is almost completely abstracted. Basically, it's a way of seeing people through all different viewpoints. And the art dealer, Kahnweiler, who I mentioned before, at the center, introduced, that's a photograph at the center and then a painted portrait on the right. He was very instrumental in bringing Cubism to the public. It was considered a very radical new style, but Kahnweiler said to these two artists, quote, "You do your painting, I will look after the rest," unquote. So again, on the right, we have this incredible portrait of Kahnweiler, and here we see his face just barely. There's a tie, there's a small still life here. But again, the picture plane is completely broken up into cubes, triangles, and that's how the term cubism came along. Kahnweiler had been primed for the shock of Cubism by his visits to Picasso's studio the year before he started supporting their works. He lived in a completely ramshackle studio known as the Bateau Lavoir. It was a building in Montmartre. And Kahnweiler found Picasso isolated and depressed. The largest composition the artist had ever made, which we have in the middle, perhaps his most famous work to date, is called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and it's in the center. Some of you may have seen it at the Museum of Modern Art. But his art was going in a direction his friends couldn't follow and didn't understand, and frankly thought that he was starting to lose his mind. But Kahnweiler got it. He understood it. And when he laid eyes on the Demoiselles d'Avignon, he was completely stunned and dazzled. And meeting Picasso at the moment when he was doing this painting really changed both of their lives in a way. And Kahnweiler returned the following day, and he bought several gouaches and small paintings to sell. So perhaps in a way to expand their reputations, Kahnweiler not only took on both Picasso and Braque and Cubism as something for his own gallery, but he commissioned them to make prints. And we see a Picasso on the right and a Braque, Picasso on the left, a Braque on the right. And wherever you don't see a name associated with an artist, just assume it's Picasso, because that's going to be pretty much what we're going to be talking about today. So prints are multiples. You can make 10 of them. You can make hundreds of them. And so what Kahnweiler did is he commissioned them to make these prints, and then he published the prints under his name. And this way, the works could move out into sort of a broader arena than perhaps a painting would. And one of the things that was very important to their work was collaboration, Picasso and Braque. And here we see a Georges Braque on the left, a Picasso on the right. And they developed Cubism together, and Braque later commented that during the period that they created this artistic style, they were, quote, like two mountain climbers tied together, really step by step, working in a collaborative fashion. And there are many paintings and prints and drawings, so it's really hard to tell who did what. So they worked together very assiduously for a number of years, and then Braque became involved in the First World War. So at that point, their relationship sort of ended, and they went their separate ways, working in different careers. And one thing that was very important to them was what was called papier collé, which is basically were pieces of paper, newsprint, wallpaper, all sorts of different objects are cut into pieces and put on top of a surface, very much sort of confusing the eye, a sort of compositional and visual trickery in a way, but it's something that was very important to them and one that we have in the exhibition, otherwise known as collage in English. So believe it or not, he goes from the painting on the right to the drawing on the right. He goes from complete abstraction to what was then known as a return to order, a return to realism. And so he went to Italy and spent some time with the person who we see on the right, Leonide Massine, and here they are in the ruins of Pompeii in 1917. It's a wonderful, wonderful photograph. At the time, Picasso became very interested in the theater. He was following around Serge Diaghilev's Ballet Russe. He was interested in not only the performers, but one performer in particular, the dancer Olga Koklova. She was one of the dancers for Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, and they fell in love. And here we see another example of a photograph, a painting, and then a beautiful pastel drawing. There's actually an exhibition up at the Museum of Modern Art right now, which looks precisely at one particular year, which is a year in between these, 1921, that looks at his sort of return to these very classical roots. And you can see in a lot of these works, they look like the clothing they wear, that these women wear, it looks like it comes from classical antiquity, from Hellenistic sculpture. So his very is a return to classicism. And Olga Koklova also was considered herself far more upscale than his previous partner, Fernand Olivier, and she was really interested in the finer things. They moved to a nicer neighborhood, they had a son named Paolo, and they lived, again, in sort of a tonier part of town. And here we have a beautiful drawing in our exhibition, which was often titled Woman Standing with One Arm Behind Her. And this is one of the interesting things about working with an artist is, sometimes there are questions about who's the sitter. There's a question about who's the artist. And Emily and I really felt strongly that this could very well be Olga Koklova. And if you see a portrait of her with her hair down, it very much looks like her. And it's hard to see probably in this slide because it may be a little bit too bright, but she's also wearing what sort of looks like a Greek toga. So again, we had this reconnection back to antiquity at this moment. This is another wonderful drawing in the exhibition which shows his interest in the ballet. And another stage figure, Pierrot, who is a clown. We see a wonderful drawing, again, from our collection on the left, and then a painting that it is related to on the right. So now things get really complicated. So while Picasso was married to Olga Koklova, he began a relationship with Marie-Thérèse Walter, and she's depicted here on the left. She was a 17-year-old young woman who he met on the streets of Paris and asked her to become his model, and they began a long-term affair. He was very interested in the sort of sensual and athletic aspects of her body, and he conveyed Walter's classical features. I'll show you this next. We see here he showed her features in his very curvilinear, sensual manner. And as Walter said later about the artist, he took me to his studio, he looked at me, he seduced me. He kept looking at my face. When I left, he said, "Come back tomorrow." And then afterwards, it was always tomorrow. So this relationship continued for many, many years. So as he was leaving his relationship with Olga Koklova and starting a relationship with Marie-Thérèse Walter, he started another relationship with the surrealist photographer Dora Maar. And one thing that I find is quite interesting is this sort of the dichotomy. One is soft and round and sensual, and the other is, with black hair, very aggressive features, very angular, very pointed. So we'll be looking a little bit more at those differences. One of my favorite works, although I'm going to keep saying this because they're all my favorite works, but is a print called Miniature Macchia. And this is an incredible large scale, it's about this big, large scale etching. And there's been entire books written just about this print, just trying to figure it out. The iconography is so complicated and there's so many different interpretations. But what we see here is a minotaur, which is basically half man, half beast, going towards this young girl who looks a lot like Marie-Thérèse, but she's holding up a candle, and minotaurs are blinded by the light. So he's sort of holding up his hand. There's a man going up a ladder on the right. There's a woman dressed as a bullfighter, a toreador. We have to remember Picasso is Spanish. He's not French. He's from Spain. He sees lots of bullfights on a horse, which is getting disemboweled. Its innards are going down on the ground. Then these two women here with a dove. So again, hard to know exactly what it means, but Miniature Macchia basically translates to the battle of the Minotaur. So here there's some sort of battle going on. And again, I think when we look at her profile, we can definitely see Marie-Thérèse Walter. This is a portrait of her that was used for the frontispiece of a book. And this was part of our advertising. You might have seen it blown up walking in here, not the work of art itself, but a very classical sort of Grecian look to her. And I put this up here just because it shows the sort of usefulness, this drawing from the Morgan Library in New York, this very sensitive, beautiful rendering of her. And if we want to know exactly how much Marie-Therese Walter is worth in market terms, just 2 days ago, this painting, which depicts her, sold for $139 million at auction. No, it's not in the exhibition. Sorry. But it's really incredible. And I think market associations, or that's a whole different lecture, are really fascinating with Picasso, what is considered valuable and what isn't. And I think this period of his life with Marie-Therese Walter has been very romanticized, eroticized, sensualized. And I think and the images themselves are very sensual, if not erotic. So in any case, going back to Dora Maar, this is a large-scale print that the Art Institute of Chicago bought in 1994. And we see, it's called The Weeping Woman, and it belongs to a series of paintings, prints, and drawings that almost all depict Dora Maar, and we can tell it's her because of her sort of black coiffed hair, her she always had sharp lacquered fingernails, but here she's weeping. So we have her sharp sort of scissor-like hands, this is her handkerchief, spikes or nails coming out of her eyes, her face completely disfigured in grief. So she's just incredibly sorrowful. And again, we see the painting to which it relates and a portrait of Dora Maar. This painting, this print was very much related to another one of Picasso's very well-known works called Guernica. And Guernica was a town in northern Spain that was bombed by the fascists and killed many innocent women and children. And so Picasso took this on as a cause and made a large-scale mural of it. And here I show you two details here of this woman here and this woman here. Here she's carrying her dead child, and her head is thrown back in agony. And we see another woman potentially falling out a window screaming. So again, this weeping woman very much comes out of those sort of political moments. And I show you two photographs by Dora Maar. She was a surrealist. They're absolutely gorgeous, fascinating photographs. These are blown up huge. No, the one on the right is not a portrait of Picasso after their breakup. But it's a strange little figure called an ubu, who's very often depicted as a sort of a king figure in surrealist literature. But I thought it's interesting to see some of her photographs, which are, again, not in the exhibition, but they're really beautiful. So another important figure for Vollard is that of the Minotaur, who we saw before in Minotaur Macchia, the Battle of the Minotaur. And we have we have two really very important drawings. And the Minotaur was half man, half beast. And he was an important figure for the surrealists, but especially for Picasso, because he became kind of an alter ego for the artist, seeing himself as full of male virility and sexuality. And these are some of these images. People could say, well, why are you showing that in the age of Me Too? This is part of his production. This is part of what made Picasso Picasso. And we dealt with these very very carefully in the labels. How we discussed some of this imagery, but these are two phenomenal works. And my wonderful colleague Emily is going to be giving a talk in the new year about the women collectors of Picasso from Chicago. And that's one of the works on the right. It tells a fascinating story in and of itself. And this is a journal that the Surrealists put out called Minotaur, and we see one cover of the journal by Miro and another by Picasso, just to give a sense of how prevalent this figure of the Minotaur was at the time. Picasso was commissioned to produce a powerful series of prints known as the Vollard Suite, named after his dealer, or named after a dealer, Ambrose Vollard, at the center. Vollard was one of the most important dealers in Paris at the time. He sold works not only by Picasso, but by Paul Cézanne, Vincent van Gogh, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and others. He was sort of the go-to person. He published many print portfolios and illustrated books the Vollard Suite probably being among his most famous. There are 100 works in the Vollard Suite. We only have a handful in the exhibition. But again, Picasso very much calls on figures from antiquity and his personal life. And it's a little bit hard to see, but this is sort of a printed manifestation of the drawing that I showed you before. Here we have a minotaur and a woman whose head is bent back. And then here we have a sort of a female type of minotaur who's called a harpy in this print. And here again we see Vollard standing in front of a painting by Picasso. And now you're all experts, a cubist, Picasso on the right, another wonderful portrait of Vollard. And just to give you a sense of how important was he? He was so important. These are just 3 of the works that were sold through Vollard that are here in the Art Institute of Chicago. The Van Gogh, The Old Guitarist by Picasso, and Paul Cézanne's very famous Basket of Apples. So another person I always like to bring to light is the printer Roger Lacourière. And here we see a photograph of him on the left. If you've never heard of him, I'm not at all surprised. He's not very well known, but he was the person who actually printed The Weeping Woman. He printed Minotaur Macchia. He printed the entire Vollard Suite. He printed almost all of Picasso's works that came from copper plates. And here we see him at his, this is a printing press, which we see on the left, Lacourière in his studio. He had a very well-respected studio in the Montmartre neighborhood. And then we see Picasso with one of Lacourière's associates, Jacques Frayot. As I mentioned, he's wearing the sort of apron so he doesn't get dirty from the printing press. And one thing I think it's important to keep in mind is what we tend to know about artists who make prints is this is the copper plate on the left on which the artist would draw, and then the final product, which is the etching or the lithograph or the linocut, that came out in the end. So, and I show you a different artist drawing on a copper plate and then the final product at the right. But we don't know much about, or what people don't tend to know, is that there's often another person involved in everything that goes on between drawing on the plate and the final product. And that is, in Picasso's case, the printer. So this is just a very quick example of the various processes involved in making etching. So here you have the copper plate, which goes into an acid bath. The copper plate, just in a nutshell, the copper plate is covered with a resistant ground, sort of like a waxy ground. The artist draws in the ground, and whatever is exposed will then be eaten away by the acid. So what the artist wants to print black would be what he or she draws, put in an acid bath. The acid goes in and eats away at all the areas that are uncovered. And then it comes out. Then ink goes on the plate, big gobs of ink, usually at the beginning, and then it is very delicately wiped off the surface. So only the ink goes in the grooves that were bitten away by the acid. And then the paper is wet and then put through a press, and that's what we see here. And then that's the copper plate, and then there's the print. So again, this is all the printer doing for the most part, certainly with Picasso's prints in between. And Roger Lacourière was really his go-to person for making these intaglio prints. So again, we see Lacourière here at the press, and then one of the wonderful prints from the Vollard Suite. So the last section we're going to talk about is his late work. And here he had very important relationships with François Gillot, who died earlier this year at the age of 101. Jacqueline Roch, his last wife on the right, and another printer for another process whose name was Arnera. So Picasso left the bustling streets of Paris, and he set up a number of studios in the south of France during the last 3 decades of his life. And his main preoccupations were the physical spaces where he lived and his partners and his children at the time. They were his frequent models. So far from the aging man in his 70s, 80s, and 90s, he was incredibly active, incredibly busy during the last part of his career. Sort of an iconic image on the left of François Gillot And part of the reason I think it's so iconic is because he's sort of in the servant role here, and she's really coming forward. So again, Françoise Gillot, who died early this year, was an esteemed painter, was a painter her entire career. And despite her abilities as a painter and as an author, she was probably best known as Picasso's partner from 1943 to 1953. They met at a restaurant when Gillot was 21 and Picasso was 61. He liked the younger ladies, obviously. And for years, they shared a very warm relationship. But when Gillot decided to leave him, in part because of his infidelities, and take their two children, Picasso turned quite vengeful. And Gillot claimed after their separation, quote, "I am the only woman who did not sacrifice herself to the sacred monster," meaning Picasso. So in 1963, she published a wildly successful novel, which has been reprinted many times, called Life with Picasso. And Picasso was so enraged by the truths that she told in this novel and her disparagement of him that he never spoke to their children, Claude and Paloma, again. But Gillot used the proceeds from the sale of her memoir to support her small family. And here we see them in their in their happier days. This is Françoise Gillot and their two children, Claude Picasso and Paloma Picasso. And this is a wonderful print in the exhibition, a lithograph of Paloma as a little girl. I'm afraid we've all had that haircut. Mom, you're in the audience. You gave me that haircut, and I, in turn, gave it to my own poor daughter. It's somehow a rite of passage of being a little kid. But just to remind you, Paloma Picasso was a very well-known, or is a very well-known fashion designer. She's very well-known for her collaborations with Tiffany & Company. And I believe in the 80s, I'm an 80s girl for this very specific shade of red lipstick. And then here we see the two children playing with their mother, reading a book above. And these are all of Picasso's children. Paloma, this is Maya Picasso, the daughter he had with Marie-Therese Walter. This is the son he had with Olga Koklova. And then I would not have wanted to been at that dinner table with all the wives present. But he did have quite a number of children. So this is another example of his very different depictions of the same subject. So on the left, we have, these are both, the one on the left and the right are portraits of Françoise Gillot. One is called The Egyptian on the right, which is again this sort of cubist, slightly awkward, willfully awkward depiction. Her hands look like giant sausages. But it was named by the printer, La Courrière, who I mentioned before, because he said her hair was coiffed in a way that he thought she looked like an Egyptian statue. So that's why it was called The Egyptian. And then Woman in an Armchair on the right, which is a very different sensibility, but also a very strange hands. The depiction of the hands, I think, is quite, outsized and sort of strange looking. And here again, I show the two children grown up. Claude, eventually on the right, Claude passed away earlier this year. And he was the head of what was called the Picasso administration, which handles, as you can imagine, all the many rights issues that come along with Picasso's name. And now his daughter, Paloma, has taken it over. So one very important, the last collaboration we're going to talk about is relationship with his linocut printer, whose name was Arnera. And this started in the 1950s. Picasso worked with this linocut printer, Hidalgo Arnera, to produce posters for ceramic exhibitions and bullfights. And here we see him holding these two blocks, which are linoleum blocks, basically the exact same material as linoleum flooring and that one might see in a kitchen, but you can make prints off of them. And here we see Arnera holding one up, and then our wonderful still life with lunch at the end. And the process was very, just to give you a sense of how intense the collaboration was, the printer described their working method in this way, quote, "Picasso worked at night. In the morning, Marcel, the chauffeur, who we see here at the car, brought what he had completed to the print shop with notes added by Jacqueline Roch, his wife who's coming out of the car. I pulled the proofs and returned them to his home, La Californie, at exactly 1:30. Very idiosyncratic method, but it basically involved Picasso looking at the prints, his wife doing the inscriptions for him. Here, Arnera, here's what you should do. The chauffeur bringing the blocks back over, and Arnera printing them again, and they would repeat it again and again and again over hundreds of times. But I want to just take a little bit of time to tell you about the process of linocut, because it's very complicated and it's a little bit like math, which makes my head hurt. But it's very interesting, and it shows you how very experimental Picasso was. He and Arnera were thought of as really inventing this reduction linocut method. And I just wanted to point out, if you look in the exhibition, these are signed with all of the notes for printing, not by Picasso, but by Arnera, the printer. So he gets credit as well. And we're just going to do a quick demonstration of linocut. Obviously, this is not Picasso. But what you do is you start with just one block, the linoleum block, which is quite flat, quite thin. Very popular because it's super cheap. It's easy to print. It's super cheap materials. So what you do first is you ink up most of the entire block, and then you have your base color, which here is yellow. And then you print many, many, many more of those, just the yellow. Then you cut out other areas, which you see here, there's more cut out in the flower area. Ink up another color. And then you put that yellow on top of this one, pull another one. Again and again and again, the same one. Then you cut out more. You can see even more has been cut out of the linoleum block. Then you ink it here in green with a roller, just like you would, painting your walls at home. And as you see, every color is printed on top of the next one. So the artist has to know in advance what they want it to look like, what they want the colors to look like, because once you've cut it out, it's gone. You can't put it back. And you can also ink up various smaller elements in the linoleum here, like this artist is doing. You show she's changed her nail color. Here she's just using the red to the center of the flower. And that's another thing you can do, is just ink up selective parts. And then we'll see this. I can't remember the artist's name, but it's just a YouTube video. It's very hard to find a YouTube video that's under 20 minutes that describes the linocut process. I thought you'd definitely be sleeping by then. So here we see just the center are printed in different colors. And then we have more colors going on. But most of the yellow that he first printed is now covered up by all the other layers. But there are elements of it that pop through where he wanted it to pop through. And now it really comes, because yellow and purple are, of course, opposites. But again, the yellow's still there. I mean, you can understand why he'd want to work with a printer. Picasso didn't have a lot of patience, and he didn't want to go through all of these, printing and printing and printing and printing. He wanted someone to do that work for him. You can also go in and remove the ink, as she's doing here, because remember, she wanted that center to print red. She doesn't want it to print green. So she wipes off the green and then puts an even darker red in some of the central areas. But again, one really has to think ahead of time, and you can imagine how many times things were printed. It's like, oh no, I wrecked it. I've got to start all over again. But you really have to commit in a way, because you're printing all of the first colors before you dig into the second ones. We're almost done. And one of the things, so here we see the center and the little butterfly. No, sorry, the bee. And I think that's the end. But one of the ways the artist was able to pay the printer, A would pay them, but then the printer often kept a large number of the prints themselves. And those ones signed by Arnera were kept by the printer most of his life. And so he had this huge cache of prints, which has come on the market fairly recently in many museums and able to buy them. So now if you look at the series again, you can hopefully understand that this was the first one, then he cut out more, then he cut out, for the gray. No, then he cut out the brown parts for the gray, and then he cut out the parts he wanted to print black. See, it makes my head hurt. I always get it wrong. But in any case, you can do this again and again. And we also have this wonderful lino cut by him, which Emily brilliantly added at the last minute to our exhibition. I think people will really enjoy it. But again, a multicolored lino cut print. And our last guest of honor here this evening is Jacqueline Roch. Shown on the left was Picasso's second wife, who depicted frequently. They were married from 1961 until Picasso's death in 1963. And Roch very much supported his art and ran his household. She was the individual I mentioned who was doing the notes on the lino cuts before they went back to the printer. And he drew her more than probably any of his previous models, in part because they were together longer than any of his previous relationships. They met when she was working at a pottery shop in the south of France, and Roch characterized their connection, quote, "Pablo is the very essence of care, tenderness, and generosity. How lucky I was that my marriage to her first husband did not succeed. Otherwise, I should have missed out on life." And we will end with that positive note on Picasso, and I encourage you all to go see the exhibition and see it many times. Thank you. Those of you who want to leave, obviously feel free to do so, but we do have some time for questions. Those of you who have questions, please raise your hand and a staff will bring a microphone to you so everyone can hear it.
Who actually did the cutting of the linoleum?
I think it was probably a collaboration between the two of them. Arnera generally did the printing. Picasso generally did the cutting. I can imagine there were some examples in which Arnera added a hint here or there, but it was really more Picasso did the cutting.
Just keep your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you.
I can't see very well, so hopefully I'll hear the questions.
In the middle of the auditorium, Jay.
Can you say something about the influence of primitive African art on Picasso? Did it influence, it certainly influenced his La Dames de...
That one.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And actually Susan Preston Blier, who is a professor of African Studies at Harvard, is going to be giving a lecture on exactly that topic in the new year. He was very influenced by African art. And what we did actually for this exhibition is we have a little tour that you can see online and in the galleries where you can go through our permanent collection and see works that are connected to this circle of influence with Picasso, and one of those is African sculpture. So he was very, very influenced by African masks specifically, and we see that in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. So it's a very, very rich topic, and there's a whole book by Susan Preston Blier on the Demoiselles d'Avignon and the connection to Africa. And she brings a very important perspective, being a historian. So, yes, in a nutshell.
I realize that it's a digression from drawings and paper art, but I'm curious because I think that we've been told that it's from life, that it's the head of a woman, and your comments about our Chicago Picasso that so many people puzzle over.
Yes, that's a question. So is the question whether things are drawn from life, or is the question about the Picasso sculpture?
She said both.
Oh, okay. So Picasso often did work on his own in a studio, and people were often in his mind. It wasn't like they sat there, he necessarily drew after them all the time. He was really kind of a solitary worker. And it's interesting, the Picasso sculpture this is going to sound horribly offensive, but this is what we've read, that it could either be related to his last partner, Jacqueline Roch, or be a portrait of his dog. But lately, I've been reading more that it was Jacqueline Roch with that big, just yesterday I was reading more information that it is probably her. But again, it doesn't have to be anyone. It may just be evocation of woman, and Jacqueline Roch was the woman in his life at the time. So I hope I answered your questions. Any more? Are we done?
I believe that concludes Q&A.
All right.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.